Hello and welcome to North Country Matters. My name is Paige Smith and I'm a student majoring in communication and media at Clarkson University. Today we are hosting a voter education conversation about the casino gambling ballot measure this fall with St. Lawrence University professor and economist Steven Horwitz. Joining him in conversation is Liam Hunt, professor emeritus of history at St. Lawrence University and a member of the League of Women Voters of St. Lawrence County. Welcome, Liam. Well, you got to start.
Stephen, hello. I'm here with Steven Horwitz, who is one of our country's leading free market libertarian economists. And I think you'll get a sense of what that means from our conversation today. And we're here to talk about the first ballot that will appear, the first of 6 proposals that will appear on the ballot, the one authorizing casino gambling at 7 sites outside of Indian reservations. Before we get into the pros and cons of this, I'd like to explain a little bit, since I had to find this out myself, just what these propositions are and what they aren't, and where they come from. They come from the legislature. They don't come from citizen petitions. We can't, as it turns out, do that in New York State. A number of states, about half of the states, have provisions that are called initiative, referendum, and recall. These are products of the progressive movement in the early part of the 20th century. And these enable citizens to put propositions on the ballot by gathering a certain number of signatures. Initiative proposes a new law. Referendum repeals an existing law, and recall, of course, removes an elected official from office. As we've seen in recent history, there have been a number of controversial cases involving these things. California recalled a governor, introduced a property tax restriction. Wisconsin tried and failed, or petitioners tried and failed to recall a governor recently. We can't do that here. We can't recall Governor Cuomo if we wanted to. We can't, for example, repeal the SAFE Act directly by petition. These things then come from the legislature, and the one we're going to be talking about first of all is authorizing. Here's the text of it: authorizing casino gambling. The proposed amendment to Section 9 of Article 1 of the Constitution would allow the legislature to authorize up to 7 casinos in New York State for the legislated purposes of promoting job growth, increasing aid to schools, and permitting local government to lower property taxes through revenues generated. Shall the amendment be approved? Now, the wording of that proposal has been challenged in court unsuccessfully as an example of kind of push polling, where the question is framed in such a way as to coach an appropriate response. Stephen, do you think that's a fair charge?
I don't know if I'd use the phrase push polling, but it's certainly the case that the argument or the ballot proposal itself has assumptions in it or has an argument in it, right? That if these are approved, they will generate those results. And so whether, even if whether those are true or not, it's certainly the case that it's interesting to see a ballot proposal that has that purpose attached to it, and sort of, at least as you say, Liam, suggest to voters that the results of saying yes to this will be these things.
Exactly, and that's why I mentioned the fact that this is actually coming from the legislature or the Board of Elections, and not from, because if this were the result of a citizen's petition, you'd expect it to be framed in a kind of an advocacy way.
Yeah, right,
but
and
here
possibly over different issues too.
Absolutely, absolutely. So there is that sort of question, and apparently it's working, because the Siena Research Institute took a poll recently and found that if you asked people simply, do you approve or disapprove casino gambling, the outcome was split, 46-46. When you read them the actual language of the ballot, it was 56% in favor and 42%. So that kind of thing works. And that's something also just generally to keep in mind about polls and ballot propositions, that a great deal depends on the way the issue is framed, on the framing of the issue. And that's not peculiar to this country. I think it's a universal human trait. So how plausible, as an economist, do you find the claims, the economic claims specifically, that are being made for this proposal?
I mean, they are plausible. We've seen places that have adopted casino, that have legalized casino gambling, have done well. It's helped my hometown of Detroit, which needs all the help it can get, has legalized in the last decade or so, and that has helped some.
Are you serious? Because that was an example I was going to suggest, because my wife's from Detroit, of one that hasn't been anywhere nearly as successful.
I think that's fair to say. Not as successful.
Detroit has lots of other problems.
Right. Not as successful as the advocates perhaps promised, but I don't think it's hurt, and I think it's probably helped a little bit.
Clearly not a panacea for any problem.
Right. And the question with all these sorts of things is, to what degree does this, something like a casino, simply pull spending from other places where it would have been spent, or whether does it in fact create new opportunities? Do consumers, do citizens view this as a net addition to the kinds of things they think are value creating that they want to spend money on, or are they simply gambling instead of going to the movies or eating out dinner? And I think that's the difficult question to figure out. And part of the answer is that we don't know. And so one of the reasons to perhaps support this is to see whether or not this is a better alternative, or people would rather be doing this with their time and their money than something else. So I think sort of there's a danger, as you say, of begging the question in this proposal, but that doesn't mean it's not, it might well be true, and we, it's hard to know sometimes without giving people the opportunity to find out.
We do have experience in New York, because obviously there are casinos on the reservations, and we'll get back to that in a minute. Are the results indecisive as to whether or not it's
again,
a net gain?
Like Detroit, there's so many complicating factors in there. It's hard to know exactly what the impact has been. Certainly, I think from at least the bit I know about it, things like unemployment and so forth on the reservations has not been worsened by this, and perhaps better. But again, you have to disentangle that from the other things going on, including the recession and everything else. So again, I don't think there's certainly no significant evidence in my view that says this will be a bad thing, and some evidence that suggests it could be a good thing. And I'm willing to sort of let's take the chance and see whether or not it helps.
Okay. There are, of course, non-economic objections to this. The Roman Catholic Church, churches in general don't seem to be wildly enthusiastic, although many of them have their own bingo games. The Catholic Church, I think, has said that gambling itself is morally neutral, but they're concerned about some of the implications. One secular argument, of course, is that this is a kind of regressive taxation, that it has the effect of transferring wealth from relatively poor people to relatively rich people, and also that it's a tax on stupidity. That was Voltaire's comment on lotteries in general. All this would apply to lotteries as well. Does that argument have any
Well, I mean,
force?
it's certainly true. I mean, I go to I have an economics conference I go to, which is in Vegas every other year, and it's always fun. I love to play blackjack, so when I go to Vegas, I like to gamble. And economists, my fellow economists, look at me like I'm crazy, and the usual response is, your expected return is negative. If it wasn't, Caesar's Palace would be this glorious place that it is, right? So there's certainly that. But I think for many people, one, you can win. My last trip to Vegas, I came home a winner. But it's also the case that I think people enjoy the game itself, right? So
you don't make money drinking wine or going
to the ballet.
Exactly.
That's exactly the right. I mean, my view, again, Vegas, for example, is I could go play blackjack for a few hours, or I can go see, Cirque du Soleil or Lion King or whatever, if one form of entertainment over another. So in that sense, I'm not sure it's a tax on stupidity any more than it's a, it's a tax on one.
Well, if people really think they're going to get out of some financial hole.
If people, that's certainly the case. You're not going to pay off your credit cards by going to the going to the reservation and playing blackjack. That's for sure. How many people are really doing that, is the question. And I think certainly we see places where gambling's legalized. We have these kind of protections in place. If you walk around Vegas, you see all the ads for Gamblers Anonymous and things like that. So I'm not so concerned about that. The regressive part, I think, is more interesting, which is, to the degree that we see these opening in poor parts of the state, it is, without question, more likely the case that we see poor people going and playing. Again, if one wants to make that argument, one could say, well, shouldn't we, take movie theaters out of these places too? If we think they shouldn't be, if we found people were spending all their time going to see movies rather than on whatever else we think it is that they should be spending on. I'm not denying that it's real, and the danger's there. And certainly we know from this that it's for politicians to complain it's a regressive tax is interesting for just the reason you point out, because the lottery is exactly that, and that's the one the state's running.
Exactly. You mentioned Gamblers Anonymous and the question of addiction here. So there is a sense in which for many people, unfortunately, this is not just a form of entertainment, and it's separable even from the the unrealistic expectation that you're going to make money because you're such a good poker player. It's an addiction, and should the state, in a sense, profiteer on people's vices, or does the state have any business legislating on these private matters at all? Well,
again, I mean, I think that the comparison to alcohol addiction, or alcoholism is interesting here too. The state taxes alcohol very heavily, so if we want to think about, if you're an alcoholic and you're drinking, the state's profiting off that too. So I'm not sure if we're willing to live with one, I think we should be willing to live with the other. So for me, and I think one other point I would make about this whole issue is, right, there's certainly the economic arguments one can make for or against casino gambling, but there's and there's moral arguments one can make against it too, as you've raised, but there's moral arguments for it, which is, again, people should be free to dispose of their income as they see fit, on the assumption that they're not harming others in doing so. I mean, if you read, say, John Stuart Mill on Liberty has a whole discussion of this, and he says, look, you want to go gamble, that's fine, but you still have responsibility, say, to your children or your...
That's the point I want to make, that addictions,
Yeah.
like any addictions, don't simply affect the addict.
Right.
There are
again,
domestic issues, domestic abuse
certainly
issues,
can be,
support issues, and so forth.
And I think then we have to think about how the law handles those things.
Yeah.
Because if we say you can't engage in this kind of behavior, and no one can engage in this kind of behavior, we're also taking that freedom away from the people who are doing it responsibly. So let's deal with the irresponsibility as its own issue rather than wiping the whole option off the table.
Let's look for just a second at this whole idea of sin taxes. You can see the appeal of it. I mean, it's a solution to one of our fundamental problems. We all like generous government services, and we all hate taxes. So when you put a tax on something that is somehow kind of disreputable, or at least is clearly non-essential, that weakens the moral argument against the tax. But it's also something of a corrupting cop-out for the government, too, isn't it? Because
I mean, in the sense that if let's go back to your earlier argument. If it's problematic that you're somehow earning, you're making money off these things that people do that we think are morally questionable, right? That's an issue. It's also the case that some of those goods, if you think about cigarette taxes, for example, the very fact that these have these addicting qualities to them, or where people crave them in these sorts of ways, right? Also means that they're much easier things to tax because people are willing to continue to pay the higher price that comes with it. And the result is that we end up with people who prefer those goods or prefer those activities, as you say, paying for all these services.
It also ultimately has the effect of deterring the behavior that you disapprove of. In other words, there are people who quit smoking because of the rise in price.
That's the hope, although the literature on that is interesting. Is, again, I don't know it in depth, but it's not clear how much.
That it's not the economic factor, it's just the educational factor.
Yeah, it's not clear. And there's some deterrence there in terms of the sort of cost involved, but I think it's the bigger question is, as you say, sort of, I mean, the smoking's down not because cigarettes have gotten so expensive. We've just decided that the external effects, the third-hand, second-hand smoke and so forth, is the problem.
Right, but gasoline taxes, raising them sharply would certainly reduce consumption. We've seen this happen in the past.
But not
when they've got, not because of taxation, but when the price of oil has gone up, cars become more efficient, people buy more efficient cars.
But the interesting point there is we do reduce, and certainly in the long run, we reduce our use more significantly than in the short run. But even those are still generally revenue raisers, right? So, I mean, because it's hard, certainly in the short run, it's hard to substitute away from whatever gasoline.
Right. But speaking of taxing sin, there are other kinds of sins that we could tax. When I say sin, I should be saying victimless crimes, okay? Drugs, prostitution. Should these be legal and taxed, legal and not taxed?
I think if you're going to make the argument that says people ought to be able to, drink what they want, alcohol. If you want to make the argument, I guess, unless you're Mayor Bloomberg, people ought to be able to drink and eat what they want, right? I mean, if we think that people have the ability to make those decisions for themselves about the things we already do, and we can talk about over-the-counter drugs here too. Why aren't we thinking the same way about the others? And the other issue, of course, is when we make these things illegal, and this is certainly true of gambling as well, we drive it underground. And there's...
Well, it's true of prostitution as well. I mean, one of the arguments often made against legalizing prostitution is the damage it does to women, but in fact, making it illegal puts sex workers in a far more dangerous and vulnerable position than if they could bargain honestly and openly and sue people who didn't pay them and so forth.
Exactly. And I think when we think about, say, bring back to casino gambling, it's the same sort of thing. Why does organized crime get involved in casino gambling? It's precisely because it's illegal. Right?
Exactly.
I mean, there's Vegas is not perfectly clean, but it's certainly a lot better than it used to be now that when you've got reputable corporations with the recourse to the law on the line running these operations.
But even the criminality of Vegas is probably a product of its history, right? I mean, it originated as a racket.
Right, and to some degree people supporting their gambling habits too, right? Yeah.
Exactly, okay. What general moral principles do you think underlie the whole relationship of economics to social life? I know you're a believer in the virtues, not just the efficacy, but the virtues of market relations. Could you go into that just a little bit?
Yeah, there's a lot in that question.
I realize
I think one of the things about economic activity, about markets, is that we, at least when we exchange with other people, we're dealing with them nominally anyway as equals. We're coming to that market with we both have a set of legal rights. We're engaging in some kind of trade, okay? As moral agents, we don't have equal endowments of resources, but as moral agents, we're coming as equals. And that trading activity in the marketplace makes us interdependent in important ways that make us, in fact, that cause us to generate a kind of moral response to other people. We know, I have no
Which is Adam Smith's basic argument.
Right. And actually, in theory, moral sentiments too.
Precisely, that's what I was thinking of.
I have no desire to go, burn down the price chopper, because I'm deeply dependent on them for my supply of food. So I think, and we can see that across individuals, we see that across regions, across nations, that markets create this kind of cooperation and lead us to actually treat people better than we would otherwise. Not necessarily because we in sort of internally or inherently view them as or know them, but rather we're in a structure that encourages us to treat people that way.
There are, of course, I mean, we don't have to knock heads about this now, but there are enormous differentials of power that need to be factored into this. I mean, the guy seeking a job is not on an equal basis with the employer who has a surplus of labor. I mean, I know you know that.
Right, but it's also the case that at least collectively, consumers have a great deal of power over what and in many ways, what firms have to do is respond to where consumers are in terms of their,
which can include moral preferences.
Yes, it can. Right.
I mean, you see nothing objectionable about the idea of boycotting a
no,
firm
absolutely. In fact, I
to
think
whose practice is environmental or labor you would object.
Right. Or for whatever reason, one thinks. I think boycotts and what we might call the freedom of dissociation are just as important as freedom of association. And we see this, I mean, the best example of this right now, of course, is the sort of green movement, right? Where people are choosing, or people who are concerned about the way, sort of ethical treatment of animals are trying to buy products that meet those standards. And I think there's not only nothing wrong with that, I think using that kind of the consumer's moral leverage in a way to say to producers, no, these are the
it's an extension of the democratic principle into the economic economic realm. Yeah. Let's go back to this business about the existing casinos and the fact that casino rights were given sort of kind of extraterritoriality granted to Native Americans. While this wasn't, I think, made explicit, it's clear there's a kind of reparations logic here. We, white people, stole the land from the Indians. We're going to give them casinos and some kind of compensation. How do you feel about that, morally, economically, and should it be extended to other groups which have also been victims?
I'm kind of ambivalent about this. I agree that there's no doubt of the harm that was done, right? And how one, whether the obligation to make good that harm is morally legitimate to place on current people is a complex question, right? I may have done nothing nothing prejudiced against Native Americans, though I may benefit from the things that others
did. Historical consequences.
So how does one do that? It seems to me, offering, say, Native Americans the opportunity to run casinos that we might not offer other folks is among the less damaging ways one could do that. But I'd rather open that opportunity up, not just to particular groups. I think the opportunity let me put this is sort of digress a little bit, but one of the things we're going to see happen in the 21st century is our economy is going to become increasingly about the ways people amuse and entertain themselves, because we're just getting so darn good at producing stuff, right, that we need less and less labor to do that, and more human labor. Just think about the proliferation of websites and movies and forms of entertainment and all these sorts of things. So I think the pressure is going to continue to be there for more casino gambling, more kinds of resort places.
I'd like to think more symphony orchestras.
Yeah, right. Well, yes, but actually that too. And there's evidence about that. We have more time than we used to.
That's
Even
true.
Small cities now have
That's true.
We have Orchestra Northern New York up here.
Yep.
So I think all those things are going to happen. So we have to be, in that sense, we have to be prepared for that. So I would like to open those opportunities up to everyone, whether historically it's been a good decision to use that as a way to say to Native American groups, this is a payback for the wrongs that were done. I mean, that's okay. I'm certainly okay with that. It's certainly a better way to do it than some sort of forced transfer where we start literally, we put on a tax, let's say, and we transfer that. This at least does create opportunities for jobs and development and so on in those places.
Right. Can you think of any comparable method that might be adopted for other?
I think in a lot of ways we've done increasing wrong by those groups, by by other kinds of policies that we've adopted. I mean, certainly
that have
things
contributed
like
to social dysfunction.
Yeah, the war on drugs has destroyed many African American communities, for example. If we really were looking to engage in reparations and help, we ought to end the war on drugs. Which notice,
and
right?
let a lot of nonviolent offenders out of jail.
Right. I mean,
with
US
enough to get them started.
That's right. I mean, the worst U.S. incarcerates more, higher percent of its population than anyone in the world, and a lot of those are on the kind of for playing poker in their garage, for buying certain kinds of drugs, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I did some work in local correctional facilities with guys who had no earthly reason for being locked up.
Right.
And they understood this. This is kind of a new plantation system. You used to make us work in the cotton fields, now you lock us in the slum. So we certainly agree on that. There was a recent New York Times article, to come back to the casino proposition, that it wasn't terribly interesting in itself, but it did have some interesting implications. The article noted that the anti-casino movement in New York State was weaker than elsewhere, and in Maryland, for example, where there was a real knockdown, drag-out competition, because the other side has very little money. The opponents of gambling, for example, in Maryland spent something like $900,000 in the referendum. There's been nothing like that here. But the reason is that in Maryland there were rival gambling interests that didn't want the competition.
Yes.
I mean, in New York there are probably just as many people who have the same ideological or moral objections, but there's nobody with deep pockets whose interests are involved, whose profits are affected. Exactly. And as I say, and the Native Americans have been mollified by the promise that it won't be anywhere near their turf, and the racino operators, or however you pronounce that, the racetrack operators who have been told they'll get various concessions and whatnot. And so the political implications of that are a little disquieting. I mean, it suggests that these moral and ideological issues won't get any attention unless they somehow serve some powerful economic or political interest as well.
Yeah, and I think this is always the problem of in economics we talk about is concentrated costs and dispersed benefits, or in this case, concentrated benefits and dispersed costs, right? That the benefits here are clearly to the casino operators and so on. They have every reason to want to lobby for it, whereas those groups who perceive they will pay the cost or have these moral objections, will be the one are more scattered. They're more individualized, and the loss to each of them is so small.
It's not worth their time.
That it's not worth their time.
Negative externalities here.
Yeah, I don't know if that's exactly the right word, but certainly the cost.
Well, there are some in the case of damage to the environment.
Sure, right. But that's what they're perceiving, right? But the costs of coalition building are so high for them.
Right.
In the same way that when we see this dynamic play out in all kinds of other situations as well.
Right. This obviously gets into a much larger issue we can't explore in any detail, but money in politics. Do you extend the market, the free market, to the purchase of votes and legislation?
No, but if you want to get money out of politics, get the politicians out of people's money. Right? I mean, when there's a pot of gold waiting, and just the example you raised, right? When people know that whatever the legislature does will have major economic impact on their lives, particularly when it's corporations and their profits are at stake, they've got every reason to want to start using money to persuade people to vote the way they want them to vote. So for me, the involvement and the sort of corruption of politics by money is inevitable once you have the state being a major distributor of resources. People are going to line up and find their way to convince the people who distribute to distribute in my way. So I think that's the bigger problem. I don't want to. I mean, the buying votes and so forth. No, but I think the problem here is, and I'm not. I think lobbying expenditures are a huge waste of resources compared to a world in which the state wasn't doing those things, and the resources that people spend lobbying back in the billions and billions spent on lobbying could be actually spent on providing things that make people's lives better. Food, clothing, shelter.
Right. How do you get the money out of politics from that end?
Well,
what would you have the state withdraw from?
Yeah, well, we could be here for another hour if we want to have that conversation.
Fair enough.
But I think
got 4 minutes.
Whatever those things are, and I think people differ on them. Certainly, for me, the most important things are I think the kinds of regulatory activities that we would broadly call corporate welfare. The state has no business making life easier and such. I mean, the bank bailouts are a huge example of this recently, but there's many more. And then I think there's other kinds of state, war on drugs and other kinds of regulation that governments engage in that make life particularly difficult for poor families.
And
for
are extremely
employers.
expensive to the rest of us.
Right, right, and have, I mean, we can talk about even the non-economic costs of the war on drugs.
Sure.
The Fourth Amendment basically doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
And if you have if you live in a house with a dog and the cops think you have drugs, your dog's dead, basically.
Yeah.
They're going to come in and shoot it. So yeah, there's plenty of other kinds of costs here. But if we want to talk about what's at the top of my list of things that I'd want to start paring down, it's let's focus on the ways in which government spends. And just now we're straying way off topic, but we can talk about reducing the Defense Department's budget by a lot too.
Yeah, right.
All right, but the kinds of things where government, I think, is doing positive harm,
Right.
reducing those things would certainly remove a lot of the incentive for corporations to become involved in it.
Well, Professor Horowitz has obviously run out of things to say, so we'll have to end this quickly. Before we do that, though, if you're interested in Steve's very interesting ideas, he's available on the web.
There's
a lot of
places,
YouTube
lots of
shows.
places to find me.
Do you have a blog?
Several things, places you can find
Google
me.
Steven Horwitz. Is that the best way to do it?
That's a good one. You can find me. I have a lot of YouTube stuff at learnliberty.org. You can catch me blogging at bleedingheartlibertarians.com and coordinationproblem.org. And then if you're on Facebook, you can look for me on Facebook. I have a personal page and a public figure page.
No Twitter?
I'm not. No,
Not yet.
I've sworn off Twitter.
All right.
Sorry, but we're out of time. Thank you all. These candidate conversations are a production of North Country Matters, produced here in the studios of WCKN on the campus of Clarkson University. This show is a civic collaboration between the St. Lawrence County branch of the American Association of University Women, the St. Lawrence County League of Women Voters, and the Communication and Media Department of Clarkson University. Until next time, remember, our North Country Matters.